A woman beaten for giving birth. A newborn child caught in the middle of a deadly struggle. And a secret about her dead husband that was about to set the entire territory on fire. What happens when survival collides with destiny in the untamed West? Sarah Miller held her newborn daughter, Elizabeth, and stared out the window of the lonely cabin. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was a hard place to be a widow. It was an even harder place to be a woman who had just inherited land that another man wanted. Her husband, Thomas, was 3 months in the ground, the victim of a so-called mining accident. And now, the 4 walls of the home he'd built felt less like a shelter and more like a cage, with a wolf circling just outside. "Hush now, little one," she whispered, rocking the baby, trying to ignore the angry purple bruise blooming on her own cheek. The wolf had a name. William, her brother-in-law. He had shown up just hours after the birth, his breath thick with whiskey, his eyes burning with greed. "A woman has no business owning property," he'd snarled, shoving a deed into her face. "Sign it." When she refused, his hand had cracked across her face. The shove that sent her slamming against the table was just a punctuation mark. Only the timely arrival of the town doctor had sent him away, his parting words a promise of more violence to come. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. She clutched Elizabeth tighter, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Mrs. Miller, it's Sheriff Daniels." Relief, sharp and sudden, washed over her. She unbarred the door. Sheriff James Daniels stood on the porch, his weathered face a road map of concern. He was a fair man, a steady man, and his eyes immediately locked onto the bruise on her face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Doc Peterson said there was trouble." Sarah tried to smile. "William came by. He wants the land." "And the bruise?" the sheriff asked, his jaw tightening. "I refuse to sign," she said quietly. The sheriff looked at the tiny sleeping bundle in her arms, and his expression softened. "You two shouldn't be out here alone. Not now." "This is all we have," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "This land is all Thomas left us." Before the sheriff could reply, another rider appeared, kicking up a cloud of dust. Michael Bennett. The man owned the largest ranch in the territory, an empire of cattle and grass that dwarfed her own small claim. He dismounted with an easy grace, his striking blue eyes taking in the scene, the sheriff, the bruised woman, the baby in her arms. "Sheriff, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice calm. "I saw William in town, drunk and making boasts about how he was going to claim this land, one way or another. I thought someone should check on you." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He was coming back. "Not if I have anything to say about it," the sheriff said. But Michael Bennett stepped forward. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "my ranch has a small caretaker's house sitting empty. You and your child would be welcome to stay there. You'd be safe." It was an act of shocking kindness from a man she barely knew. But she saw something else in his eyes too. A flicker of a memory, of a pain she couldn't place. "I can't accept charity," she said, her pride a flimsy shield. "It wouldn't be charity," Michael replied, a gentle smile touching his lips. "The house needs looking after, and I could use help with my accounts. I understand you were a teacher." She was stunned he knew that. A teacher from Boston, now a widow in Wyoming, holding a baby, and a piece of land a violent man was willing to kill for. She looked from the earnest sheriff to the powerful rancher, 2 men offering her a lifeline. But out here she knew, nothing was ever free. Every act of kindness had a price, and she was about to find out just how high that price could be. The caretaker's house on the Bennett Ranch was more than a refuge. It was a different world. It was clean, sturdy, and a quarter-mile from the main house, close enough for safety, far enough for privacy. For 2 weeks, Sarah and Elizabeth found a quiet rhythm they had never known. Michael Bennett was a man of his word. Each morning, Sarah would walk to the main house, Elizabeth in her arms, and spend a few hours bringing order to the chaotic mess of his ranch's books. The work was a comfort, a piece of her old life she could hold on to. "You've worked a miracle," Michael had said, looking at her neat columns of figures. His praise was a foreign warmth, something she hadn't felt in years. Her marriage to Thomas had been a practical arrangement. He was a good man, but his touch had been hesitant, his body already weakened by the miner's consumption that would eventually kill him. His death was a sorrow, but it wasn't a heartbreak. The guilt of that secret was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her grief. She was watching Michael from her kitchen window now, watching him with his men, a natural leader, confident and strong. When he looked up, as if sensing her gaze, she stepped back, a flush rising on her cheeks. Minutes later, he was knocking at her door. "Please, call me Sarah," she said, as he stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Then you must call me Michael," he replied, and his smile made the lines around his eyes crinkle. "I've just put bread in the oven," she found herself saying. "Would you care for supper?" The meal was a quiet revelation. They talked for hours, and she learned of the ranch his father had built, the empire he had expanded. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke of Boston, of her teaching career, of the financial ruin that had pushed her into a marriage of convenience. And as she spoke, she realized something unsettling. Michael Bennett was not just a kind employer. He was a man who saw her, truly saw her, in a way Thomas never had. This feeling was dangerous. It was a betrayal of the mourning period she was supposed to be in. It was a spark in a tinder-dry life. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats shattered the quiet evening. Michael was on his feet in an instant, his body transformed from a relaxed dinner guest into a coiled predator. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice suddenly hard as iron. "It's William Miller, and he's not alone." Sarah's blood ran cold. She snatched the sleeping Elizabeth from her cradle just as William's drunken voice slurred from the yard. "Bennett, I hear you're harboring my property." Michael stepped onto the porch. "Mrs. Miller and her daughter are under my protection. You'd do well to remember that." William spat into the dust. "That woman has land that's mine. Thomas would have wanted it to stay with family, not some Boston schoolmarm who barely warmed his bed for a year." Sarah flinched, the crude words hitting her like a slap. "That's enough." Michael's voice cut through the night. "The law says the land is hers." "The law?" William sneered, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Out here, a man makes his own law." One of William's men, seeing the cold, deadly calm on Michael's face, grew nervous. "Come on, this ain't worth getting shot over. Bennett's got a reputation." William hesitated, his drunken rage warring with a sliver of self-preservation. "This ain't over," he snarled, swinging his horse around. "That woman doesn't belong here, and neither does that brat. You'll regret interfering, Bennett. Mark my words." As they rode off, Michael came back inside, his face a grim mask. He came to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat tight with fear. "He won't touch you," Michael promised, his voice a fierce vow. "Either of you. I swear it." She looked up into his determined face, into his piercing blue eyes, and saw more than just protection. She saw a man who was willing to stand between her and the darkness. And that, she realized, was a far more dangerous threat to her heart than William Miller could ever be. Because in that moment, she understood that the safety he was offering came with a terrible, unspoken question. He wasn't just protecting her, he was claiming her. Autumn settled over the ranch, painting the cottonwoods in strokes of gold. 3 months passed, and the caretaker's house became a home. Elizabeth thrived, and her smiles, Sarah noticed, were often directed at Michael, who visited with a frequency that went far beyond the duties of an employer. One crisp afternoon, Martha Jensen, the ranch's housekeeper, found Sarah hanging laundry. Martha was a kind-eyed widow who saw more than she let on. "That little one is growing like a weed," Martha said, nodding at the baby in her basket. "Got her father's eyes, hasn't she?" "Yes, Thomas had blue eyes," Sarah replied. Martha gave her a knowing look. "I wasn't talking about your late husband, dear. Everyone knows William Miller's eyes are as brown as mud. Those blue eyes of hers remind me of someone else entirely." Sarah's cheeks burned. "Martha, you shouldn't—" "It's just curious how Mr. Bennett can hardly take his eyes off either of you," Martha continued, ignoring her protest. Haven't seen him this attentive since his wife died birthing their son. The clothespin dropped from Sarah's hand. His wife? He had a child? Martha's eyes widened. He never told you? It was 8 years ago now. Rebecca died in childbirth. The baby boy, too. A terrible tragedy. He was in a dark place for years. The revelation was a punch to the gut. Michael, the strong, steady man who was her protector, carried a grief so profound he couldn't even speak its name. She thought of how gently he held Elizabeth, the flicker of deep sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes. Suddenly, a wagon rattled up the drive. It was Sheriff Daniels, and beside him sat the stern-faced circuit judge, Judge Parker. An icy tendril of dread snaked its way down Sarah's spine. Michael met them on the porch of the main house, his posture tense. He saw Sarah approaching and came to meet her, his face grave. The judge has some news, he said, leading her inside. Mrs. Miller, the judge began without preamble. Your brother-in-law, William Miller, has filed a petition. He's challenging your fitness as a mother. Sarah clutched Elizabeth tighter. On what grounds? He alleges impropriety in your living arrangements, the judge said, his gaze apologetic. He claims you've entered into an immoral relationship with Mr. Bennett while still in mourning. That's preposterous. Michael's fist hit his desk. Furthermore, the judge continued, looking deeply uncomfortable, he questions the paternity of your child. He claims the timing of your pregnancy and the child's physical characteristics suggest she is not his brother's daughter. The room spun. The secret she had guarded so fiercely was now a public spectacle. If William can convince the court the child is not Thomas's, the judge said, she would have no claim to the Miller property. And neither would you. After the judge and sheriff left, scheduling a hearing for the following week, Sarah sat in the study, too shaken to move. He won't win, Michael said, kneeling beside her. He will, she whispered, tears finally falling. Because he's right, about Elizabeth. She took a shaky breath and told him everything. The failed romance in Boston, the discovery of her pregnancy, and Thomas's quiet, noble offer to give the child his name. She confessed that their marriage had never been consummated, that Thomas's illness had made it impossible. She laid her shame and her secrets bare, expecting to see disgust in Michael's eyes. She waited for him to recoil, to withdraw his offer of protection. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, he said softly. You're not disappointed? She asked, her voice barely audible. How could I be? He replied, his eyes full of a warmth that stunned her. You've shown more courage than anyone I've ever known. If anything, I admire you more. The truth hadn't pushed him away. It had pulled him closer. What do we do? She asked. We fight, he said, his voice firm as bedrock. The judge only needs to know that Thomas claimed Elizabeth as his own, and by God we will make that stick. But as Michael held her hand, a new, terrifying thought emerged. William was a drunk and a bully, but he wasn't smart enough to orchestrate a legal challenge like this. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who wanted more than just a small parcel of land. And she had a sickening feeling that the truth about Elizabeth's paternity was only the first shot in a war she was just beginning to understand. The day of the hearing, the Pinewood courthouse was a hornet's nest of whispers and stares. Sarah sat beside Michael, feeling the weight of every judgmental gaze. Across the aisle, William smirked, flanked by a slick, sharp-featured lawyer from Denver named Caldwell. This was no drunken whim. This was a calculated attack. Caldwell painted William as a concerned uncle, then put him on the stand. William spoke of Thomas's illness, casting doubt on his ability to father a child. He pointed out Elizabeth's fair hair and blue eyes, so different from the dark-haired, brown-eyed Millers. Then he moved on to Sarah's life at the Bennett Ranch, his words dripping with insinuation about her improper relationship with Michael. It was a performance, and it was brutally effective. The courtroom buzzed with scandal. When it was their turn, Sarah's lawyer, a man paid for by Michael, dismantled William's character, forcing him to admit to the threats and the assault. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt about Elizabeth's paternity had been planted. Then Sarah took the stand. She spoke of her marriage, of Thomas's illness, and of his joy at the prospect of becoming a father. She held her head high and answered every question with a quiet dignity. "Elizabeth is Thomas's daughter," she stated, her voice clear and firm. It was a lie and the truth, all at once. Thomas had made Elizabeth his daughter in his heart, and that was a truth she would carry to her grave. Michael testified next, his presence commanding the room's attention. He spoke of Sarah's employment, of his respect for her character, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of gossip. When Caldwell asked if his interest in Sarah was more than professional, Michael looked directly at the judge. "I hold Mrs. Miller in the highest esteem," he said. "Her dignity in the face of adversity and her devotion to her daughter are an inspiration." During a recess, as they paced outside, Michael turned to her, his face earnest. "Sarah, there's something I need to ask you." But before he could finish, they were called back in. The verdict was coming. Judge Parker cleared his throat. "Regarding the petition for guardianship, I find William Miller's claims to be wholly unsupported. His documented violence makes him unfit." A wave of relief washed over Sarah. "As to the question of paternity," the judge continued, "Thomas Miller acknowledged the child as his own before his death. Under territorial law, that establishes his legal paternity regardless of biology. The property belongs to Elizabeth Miller, with her mother as trustee." It was over. She had won. William leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "She's a liar and a whore. That brat isn't Thomas's." "Silence!" the judge thundered, banging his gavel. "One more outburst, Mr. Miller, and you'll be jailed for contempt." Outside in the autumn sun, William stormed away, muttering threats. Michael stood before her, his eyes shining. "Sarah, what I was trying to ask before, I've never been more certain of anything. After my wife died, I never thought I'd find happiness again. But you've brought light back into my world." He took her hands. "I love you, Sarah. I love Elizabeth as if she were my own. Say you'll be my wife." Tears streamed down her face as the single beautiful word escaped her lips. "Yes." As Michael pulled her into his arms, Sarah believed the nightmare was finally over. She had a future. She had a family. But she was wrong. Because as William Miller climbed into a wagon at the edge of town, he wasn't alone. The man holding the reins, the man who had been watching the courthouse from a distance, was the sharp-featured lawyer, Caldwell. "It didn't work," William snarled. "The legal route was a long shot," Caldwell said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He turned his head, and his eyes, a familiar, striking shade of blue, were as hard as ice. "But there are other ways to claim what's yours." He looked back toward the courthouse, where Sarah was still in Michael's arms. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face, an expression of hunger. "Don't worry, Miller," Caldwell said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "I always get what I came for: the land, the inheritance, and the girl." The wedding was set for the spring. The months that followed were a dream Sarah had never dared to have. The Bennett Ranch became her home, its rhythms and routines a source of deep comfort. Michael was a patient and devoted partner, his love a steady warmth that thawed the frozen corners of her heart. He was a natural father to Elizabeth, his gentle hands and quiet smiles a constant presence in the little girl's life. But a shadow still lingered at the edges of their happiness. William Miller had vanished after the trial, and while Sheriff Daniels said he'd likely drunk himself into a ditch somewhere, Sarah couldn't shake a feeling of unease. And then there was Caldwell, the lawyer. He had disappeared too, but the memory of his cold, calculating eyes haunted her. One evening, as Michael was reviewing the end-of-year accounts, he frowned. "That's odd," he said, tapping a page in the ledger. "The ore assays from the Silver Spur mine have dropped off significantly in the last 6 months." The Silver Spur was a small mine on the edge of Bennett's property, bordering the land that had belonged to Thomas. "I thought that vein was nearly played out," Sarah said. "So did I," Michael mused. "But these numbers don't just show a decline. They show a collapse. It's as if the silver just stopped. He was quiet for a moment, a thoughtful look on his face. Thomas was a good miner. He always said there was a richer vein somewhere in that hill, if a man just knew where to look. The next day, Michael rode out to the old Miller cabin. He said he was checking the fences, but Sarah knew he was looking for something more. He returned that evening, his face grim. "Someone's been there," he said, dropping a canvas sack on the table. "Recently." He emptied its contents. A half-empty bottle of whiskey, a discarded pickaxe head, and a set of surveyor's maps that were far too new and professional for a small-time miner like Thomas. One map was of the Miller property, but another, more detailed map showed the tunnels of the Silver Spur mine. Scrawled in the margins were a series of notes and calculations in a hand that was not Thomas's, and there was a single, crudely drawn line connecting one of the deepest tunnels of the Silver Spur directly to the land beneath the Miller cabin. "William," Sarah breathed. "And he's not just digging for silver," Michael said, his voice tight. He pointed to a faint notation on the map. It was a single word: water. He explained it then. The Silver Spur had always been a dry mine, but Thomas's land had a year-round spring. The new tunnel wasn't just about ore. It was an attempt to divert the underground water source, the very lifeblood of the valley, from the Miller property to the mine. A mine that, according to the deed office, had been sold 3 months ago. The new owner was a holding company based in Denver. A company represented by a lawyer named Caldwell. It all clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic of greed. William hadn't just wanted the land. He and Caldwell were after the water. With control of the valley's main water source, they could strangle every ranch, including Michael's, and buy them up for pennies. The attacks on Sarah, the legal challenge, it was all a desperate, vicious scheme to get her off that land before their plan was discovered. "We have to tell the sheriff," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "And say what?" Michael countered, his face grim. "That we found a map? Caldwell will claim it's a forgery. We need more. We need to find that tunnel." The next morning, they rode to the Silver Spur. The mine was deserted, a ghost of its former self. But inside they found what they were looking for. Hidden behind a false wall of rock was the new tunnel, freshly dug and shored up with new timber. It was a professional job, far beyond William's abilities. They followed the tunnel for what felt like miles, the air growing damp and cold. Finally, they saw a flicker of light ahead, the sound of voices. They crept forward and peered into a small cavern. There they were. William Miller and 2 other men, their faces illuminated by a lantern. And standing over a surveyor's table, pointing to a map, was Caldwell. "Another week, and we'll be ready to break through to the aquifer," Caldwell was saying. "Once we divert the spring, this whole valley will be ours for the taking." "What about Bennett?" William asked, his voice nervous. "Bennett will be the first to fall," Caldwell said with a cold smile. "Once his cattle start dying of thirst, he'll have no choice but to sell, to me." Suddenly a rock shifted under Michael's boot. The sound echoed in the cavern. "Who's there?" Caldwell shouted, spinning around, a pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. Michael and Sarah were trapped. "It seems our new neighbors have found us," Caldwell said, his voice dangerously calm as Michael and Sarah stepped into the light, their hands raised. William's face went white. "Bennett, what are you doing here?" "It's over, Miller," Michael said, his voice steady despite the pistol aimed at his chest. "We know everything, about the tunnel, the water." Caldwell laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You know nothing." He took a step closer, his cold blue eyes fixed on Sarah. "Did you really think this was just about land and water, Mrs. Miller?" He looked at Elizabeth, who was bundled securely against Sarah's chest. A strange, proprietary look crossed his face. "You ran out on me in Boston," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "You took something that belonged to me. I'm just here to collect." The blood drained from Sarah's face. The man from Boston. The man who had promised her marriage and then abandoned her. The biological father of her child. It was him. Caldwell. "You see," he said to the stunned room, "this was never just a business transaction. It was a family reunion." He smiled, and it was the smile of a demon. "Elizabeth is my daughter, and I've come to claim her, her inheritance, and you." The world seemed to stop. Michael stared, connecting the dots. The blue eyes, Caldwell's sudden appearance, his obsession. William looked utterly bewildered, a pawn in a much deadlier game than he had ever understood. "You're insane," Sarah whispered, clutching Elizabeth so tightly the baby let out a small cry. "I'm a businessman," Caldwell corrected her, "and a father. It's a shame, really. I had to go to all the trouble of tracking you down, only to find you'd shacked up with this rancher." He waved his pistol dismissively at Michael. "William," he said, not taking his eyes off them, "kill him. The woman and child are mine." William hesitated, his own gun wavering. "Now hold on. That wasn't part of the deal." "The deal has changed," Caldwell snarled, his mask of civility finally gone. "Shoot him, or I'll shoot you myself." In that split second of hesitation, Michael moved. He kicked a loose pile of rocks at Caldwell's feet, sending the lawyer stumbling. At the same moment, he lunged, not at Caldwell, but at William, tackling him to the ground. The cavern erupted in chaos. Caldwell fired, the bullet ricocheting wildly off the rock wall. Sarah screamed, scrambling back into the darkness of the tunnel, shielding Elizabeth with her body. Michael and William wrestled on the ground, a desperate struggle for the gun. From the darkness, Caldwell fired again, the muzzle flash illuminating his face, twisted in a mask of pure rage. A shot rang out, loud and final. William's body went limp on top of Michael. Michael shoved him off, scrambling to his feet, grabbing William's fallen pistol. He faced Caldwell across the cavern, both men armed, both ready to kill. "It's over, Caldwell," Michael said, breathing heavily. But Caldwell just smiled. "You think so?" He glanced toward the tunnel where Sarah was hidden. "I still have what I came for." Before Michael could react, Caldwell turned and fired into the timber supports holding up the cavern roof. The heavy beams cracked, groaning under the immense weight. Dust and rock began to pour from the ceiling. "The whole thing is coming down!" one of William's men screamed, scrambling for the exit. Caldwell didn't run. He just stood there, smiling, reloading his pistol. He was going to bury them all. He was going to entomb them in the dark, a final, spiteful act of possession. The mine was collapsing. Michael didn't hesitate. He fired, not at Caldwell, but at the lantern on the table, plunging the cavern into absolute darkness. He dove behind a minecart as the ceiling gave way with a deafening roar. Sarah, huddled in the tunnel, heard the crash, felt the rush of air, and screamed Michael's name. There was only silence. Then, a faint sound. A man coughing. A beam of light cut through the thick dust. It was Michael, holding a second, smaller lantern he'd had on his belt. The entrance to the cavern was completely blocked by a mountain of rock. They were trapped. From the other side of the rockfall, they heard a faint, pained groan. Caldwell. He was alive. "It's not over, Sarah," his muffled voice screamed, filled with an insane rage. "I'll dig my way out. I'll find you. You and the girl are mine. Do you hear me? Mine!" His voice was a ghost's, a promise of a haunting that would never end. Michael grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's another way. An old ventilation shaft. We have to go. Now." They scrambled through the dark, narrow tunnels, the only sound their ragged breaths and the distant mad raving of the man they had buried alive. They emerged into the blinding sunlight hours later, exhausted, bruised, and covered in grime. They had survived. The story of the secret tunnel and Caldwell's plot came out. Sheriff Daniels sealed the mine, entombing William's body and leaving Caldwell to his fate. The valley was safe. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Sarah stood on the porch of the main ranch house. Her house. She was no longer Sarah Miller, but Sarah Bennett. Elizabeth, now a toddler, played at her feet. Michael came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I was thinking about how a life can change," she said, leaning back against him. "How a terrible ending can sometimes be a new beginning." He kissed her hair. "You will be my queen," he had promised, and he had kept that promise. Every day he treated her with a love and respect that felt like the sun on her face after a long, dark winter. She was not just a widow he had rescued. She was his partner, his equal, the heart of his home. The story of Sarah and Michael Bennett is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, when hope seems lost, courage and kindness can change a destiny. It teaches us that family isn't just about the blood you share, but about the people who stand with you, who fight for you, and who see the truth of your heart. Their love story, born from violence and forged in secrets, became a legend in that small Wyoming valley, a story of how a good man's promise and a strong woman's will could build a kingdom of their own. If this story of survival, love, and unexpected justice moved you, please show your support and hit that like button below. Share this video with someone who appreciates a timeless tale from the American West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life stories of history's forgotten heroes. Let us know in the comments what part of Sarah's journey surprised you the most. Thank you for listening.